In the Texas territory of 1873, a father did the unthinkable. He sold his own daughter. He sold her because the world told him she was broken. Useless. A barren field where no life could grow. Her name was Elspeth, and her parents spoke it like a curse. For a handful of coins, they traded her future for their pride, and watched with cold eyes as she was led away into the dust. She walked with her head down, the whispers of their betrayal chasing her across the plains. Useless. Unworthy. Barren. The words were a brand on her soul, searing deeper with every step into the unknown. The men who bought her spoke in low, rough tones, their voices like grinding stones. They didn't see a woman with a shattered heart. They saw a transaction, a piece of property to be delivered. And as the wagon wheels groaned under the weight of her fate, she pressed a hand to her chest, a silent vow forming in the quiet darkness of her mind. They had cast her aside. They had sold her like cattle. But she would not break. She would endure. She believed, with a faith she didn't know she had, that even the most barren ground could hold a seed of hope. She didn't know what waited for her at the end of this dusty road. She didn't know if she would survive the night. But she knew one thing. This was not the end of her story. The wagon rattled into a small, forgotten town as the sun bled out across the horizon. Lanterns flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows down the main street. It was a place that looked like it was holding its breath, waiting for trouble. And for Elspeth, trouble had already arrived. She stepped down from the wagon, her legs trembling, and felt the weight of 100 eyes on her. The townspeople stared from doorways and saloon windows, their faces hard and curious. They saw the transaction. They saw the shame. But one man saw something else. He stood in the shadows near the livery, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with eyes that held a storm of their own. His name was Silas, and he was a man carved from loss. A widower with 5 children who clung to him like burrs, their small faces etched with a grief too big for their years. The town knew him as a tough, relentless cowboy. But they also whispered about him. They whispered about the night his wife, Elara, had died. They whispered that the grief had made him hard, made him cold, made him dangerous. He watched Elspeth, and he didn't see a barren woman. He saw a mirror of his own pain. He saw a soul as shipwrecked as his own. And a thought, reckless and desperate, took root in his mind. He needed help. His home was collapsing into chaos. His children were running wild, lost in their sorrow. And this woman, this stranger, might be the only answer he had left. He watched her, his heart a cautious drum against his ribs. He saw the fragile light flickering behind the terror in her eyes. And he made a decision that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone in that town. He stepped out of the shadows. The whispers on the street died instantly. Every eye turned to him, then to her. The air grew thick, heavy with judgment. Elspeth looked up, her breath catching in her throat as the imposing figure stopped before her. His face was weathered, his eyes a startling, intense gray. She expected cruelty. She expected a new owner. But what he said next, nobody saw coming. His voice was low, rough, like stones rolling downhill. "I need a housekeeper," he said, the words cutting through the silence. "My wife is gone. I have 5 children. The work is hard. You'll earn your keep." It wasn't an offer of kindness. It wasn't an offer of marriage. It was a business transaction, cold and simple. And for Elspeth, who had been sold for what she couldn't give, being hired for what she could do was the first breath of air in a world that was trying to drown her. She looked into his haunted eyes and saw a man just as desperate as she was. "I accept," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And with that single word, she walked from one cage straight into another. She just didn't know it yet. The ride to Silas's ranch was silent and tense. The prairie stretched out around them, vast and empty under a sky full of cold, distant stars. The house, when they reached it, was little more than a dark shape against the horizon, a place that seemed to sag under the weight of its own sorrow. As Elspeth stepped inside, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air snaked down her spine. The place was a tomb. Dust motes danced in the moonlight slanting through the grimy windows. The air was thick with the smell of stale grief. And then she saw them. 5 pairs of eyes, watching her from the shadows of a long hallway. They weren't just sad children. They were hostile. Their gazes were sharp, accusatory, like a pack of wolves sizing up an intruder. The oldest, a boy of about 12 with his father's stormy eyes, stepped forward. His name was Caleb. "You're not our mother," he said, his voice dripping with a venom that shocked her. "I know," Elspeth replied softly. "She's dead," he spat, "and you can't replace her." Before she could answer, Silas's voice cut in, sharp and final. "Go to your rooms. Now." The children scattered like frightened birds, but their hatred lingered in the air. Elspeth stood frozen, the silence of the house pressing in on her. This wasn't a home. It was a battlefield, and she had just walked, unarmed, onto the front lines. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. Every attempt she made to bring warmth or order to the house was met with silent rebellion. She'd cook a stew, and someone would, accidentally, knock the salt shaker into it. She'd mend a shirt, only to find it torn again the next day. They were ghosts in their own home, and she was the thing they had decided to haunt. The 4 younger children were shadows, flitting away whenever she came near. But Caleb was a storm. He watched her every move, his eyes burning with a silent challenge. He was the guardian of his mother's memory, and he saw Elspeth as a desecration. Silas was no better. He was a phantom in his own life, leaving before sunrise and returning long after dark, his face a mask of exhaustion. He never spoke of his late wife, Alara. Her name was a forbidden word, but her presence was everywhere. Her shawls were still draped over chairs, her worn books sat on the nightstand, a porcelain doll lay on a dusty shelf. The house was a shrine, and Elspeth felt like a trespasser. She was trapped, alone with 5 hostile children, and a man who was more shadow than substance. The isolation was crushing, the silence a constant roar in her ears. She had escaped her parents' cruelty only to find a new kind of prison. One rainy afternoon, driven by a desperate need to clean, to impose some kind of order on the chaos, Elspeth decided to tackle Alara's old sewing room. It was the heart of the shrine, a room left exactly as it had been the day she died. As she carefully folded a quilt, her hand brushed against a loose floorboard beneath the rug. Curiosity, a dangerous and forgotten feeling, stirred within her. She knelt, her fingers prying at the wood. It came up with a soft groan. And there, nestled in the dark space below, was a small, ornate wooden box. It was locked. Her heart hammered against her ribs. What was this? A secret? She reached for it, her fingers trembling, but just as she touched the cold wood, she heard the sound of heavy boots on the porch. It was Silas. Home early. She shoved the floorboard back into place, her mind racing. She stood up, smoothing her apron, just as the door swung open. Silas stood there, drenched from the rain, his gray eyes narrowed with suspicion. They swept the room, lingering on the spot where she stood. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Just tidying up," she stammered, her heart pounding. He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. He knew. He had to know she'd found something. She could see it in the hard set of his jaw, the muscle ticking there. The air crackled with a tension that was suddenly terrifying. She had stumbled onto something that was not meant to be found. And in that moment, She realized the whispers of the town might not just be gossip. The grief in this house might not just be sorrow. It might be guilt. Silas didn't press her. He just stared, his eyes boring into her, making her feel transparent. He walked past her, picked up a fallen spindle of thread from the floor, and placed it back on the sewing table with a deliberate, final click. It was a warning. Stay out. The message was clear. That night, Elspeth couldn't sleep. The image of the locked box was burned into her mind. What was inside? Why was it hidden? The questions swirled, mixing with the fear that had taken root in her heart. This wasn't just a house of grief. It was a house of secrets. The next morning, the storm outside had passed, but the one inside the house was growing stronger. Caleb was more defiant than ever. During breakfast, he stared at Elspeth, a cruel smirk on his lips. "My mother used to make the best pancakes," he said loudly, pushing away the plate of biscuits she had made. "Not like these. These taste like dirt." The younger children giggled, then fell silent as Silas shot them a look. "Eat your food, Caleb," Silas said, his voice flat. "I'm not hungry," Caleb retorted, shoving his chair back and storming out of the house. Elspeth's hands trembled as she cleared the plates. She felt Silas's eyes on her, but he said nothing. His silence was worse than any anger. It was a wall she couldn't climb, a void she couldn't cross. Later that day, she was hanging laundry on the line when she saw Caleb near the old well, trying to pull up a heavy bucket of water. He was struggling, his small frame straining. For a moment, her heart softened. He was just a boy, drowning in a man's sorrow. She walked over. "Here, let me help you." He whirled around, his face a mask of fury. "I don't need your help." He gave the rope a furious tug. It slipped from his grasp. The crank spun wildly, the rope whipping through the air. Elspeth instinctively jumped back, but not before the heavy wooden handle of the crank flew off its axis. It missed her head by an inch, smashing into the post beside her with a sickening crack. She stared at the splintered wood, her heart seizing in her chest. An accident. It had to be an accident. But when she looked at Caleb's face, she saw no shock, no fear. She saw a flicker of cold, calculated satisfaction. He had tried to hurt her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a child's tantrum. This was something darker, deeper. He didn't just want her gone. He wanted her gone by any means necessary. She backed away slowly, her eyes locked on the boy who looked at her with the eyes of an executioner. She turned and ran back to the house, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to leave. She couldn't stay here. This place was dangerous. The father was a walking storm cloud of secrets, and his son was a viper. She burst into the kitchen, ready to pack her meager belongings. But she stopped short. Silas was there, sitting at the table. He hadn't gone to the fields, and on the table, between his calloused hands, sat the small, ornate wooden box from beneath the floorboards. It was open. "Looking for this?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. He pushed the box towards her. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were letters. Dozens of them, tied with a ribbon, and something else. A small silver locket. She stared at him, speechless. "My wife," he said, his voice cracking for the first time. "She was writing to her sister. She was unhappy." He looked up at her, and the mask was gone. In its place was a raw, terrifying despair. "She was going to leave me," he whispered. "The day she died, she was packed and ready to go." The town's whispers echoed in her head. The mysterious death. The husband with the cold heart. "What happened to her?" Elspeth asked, her voice barely a tremor. Silas looked away, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. "There was a storm," he said, his voice hollow. "A bad one. The horse spooked on her way to town. The wagon overturned at the creek." It sounded plausible. It sounded like a tragic accident. but Elspeth saw the flicker in his eyes, the way his hand clenched on the table. He was leaving something out, a crucial piece of the story. And then she heard it. A small sound from the hallway. A footstep. A creak. Someone was listening. She glanced towards the doorway and saw a flash of movement. It was Caleb. He had been standing there, in the shadows, listening to every word. And the look on his face wasn't just hatred anymore. It was fear. Pure, unadulterated terror. What did that boy know? What secret was he hiding behind all that anger? Elspeth looked from the terrified boy to the broken man at the table. She had walked into a story halfway through, and every page she turned revealed a darker truth. The accident at the well, the hidden letters, the son's terror. It was all connected, and she was standing right in the middle of it. The truth about Alara's death wasn't just a secret. It was a threat, and it was still alive, breathing in the very walls of that house. The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Silas didn't try to explain the fear in his son's eyes. He just closed the box, the click of the latch sounding like a coffin sealing shut. He stood up. "Stay away from her things," he said, the wall back up, his voice once again flat and cold. He took the box and left the kitchen, leaving Elspeth alone with the chilling aftermath. She knew she had to get out. This was not her fight. This family was a tangled knot of secrets she had no business trying to unravel. Her own survival was at stake. That night, she waited until the house was still, until the only sound was the wind howling across the plains. She packed her few belongings into a small bundle. Her plan was simple: slip out before dawn and walk to the next town. It was a risk, but it was better than staying here, waiting for another accident. As she crept towards the front door, a floorboard groaned under her foot. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. A small voice whispered from the darkness. "Are you leaving?" It was the youngest child, a little girl named Lily, no more than 5 years old. She was standing in the hallway, clutching a raggedy doll, her eyes wide in the moonlight. "We don't want you to go," she said, her voice trembling. Before Elspeth could answer, another small figure appeared, then another. Soon, all 4 of the younger children were there, their faces pale and frightened. "Caleb is mean," whispered one of the boys, Samuel. "He misses Mama, but we like your stories." Elspeth looked at their small, hopeful faces, and her resolve shattered. They weren't monsters. They were just lost children, terrified of the storm that was their older brother and the ghost that was their father. They were caught in the middle, just like her. How could she leave them? Her escape plan dissolved into a cloud of impossible choices. Staying was dangerous. Leaving felt like a betrayal she couldn't stomach. She had been abandoned by her own family. How could she do the same to these children? With a heavy heart, she led them back to their beds, tucking them in with a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. "I'm not going anywhere tonight." The next day, a new, fragile truce seemed to settle over the house. The younger children followed Elspeth around, their initial hostility replaced by a shy curiosity. Even Caleb seemed to retreat, his anger simmering beneath a watchful, brooding silence. He knew she'd seen his fear. He knew she knew something was wrong. Elspeth decided on a new strategy. If she couldn't escape, she had to understand. She had to find out what really happened to Alara. Not for Silas, but for these children. And for herself. She started watching, listening. She noticed how Silas never went near the creek where Alara had supposedly died. She saw the way Caleb would flinch whenever a horse whinnied too loudly. She saw the way the townspeople would fall silent when Silas rode past, their eyes full of a pity that was laced with something else. Suspicion. One afternoon, while she was in town for supplies, she took a chance. She stopped by the blacksmith's shop, a place run by a grizzled old man named Jedediah, who was known for his sharp eyes and even sharper tongue. Making small talk, She casually mentioned the Silas Ranch. Jedediah stopped hammering and looked at her, his eyes narrowed. "You're the new woman out there." It wasn't a question. "I am," she said. "Brave of you," he grunted, turning back to his anvil. "After what happened to the last one." "A tragic accident," Elspeth said carefully, repeating the official story. Jedediah let out a harsh laugh. "Accident? That's what the sheriff called it. But some things, they don't add up." "Like what?" she pressed, her heart starting to beat faster. He wiped his brow with a sooty hand. "Like the fact that Alara was one of the best horsewomen in this territory. No summer squall would have spooked her horse that bad. And the wagon. The axle was busted clean. Looked less like it broke in a crash, and more like it was helped along by a saw." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Sheriff's a friend of Silas's. Closed the case faster than a sinner on Sunday. But folks remember. They remember the fights Silas and Alara used to have. Screaming matches you could hear all the way to town." Elspeth felt a wave of nausea. A tampered wagon. A cover-up. She thanked Jedediah and hurried away, her mind reeling. This changed everything. Alara's death wasn't an accident. It was murder, and the prime suspect was the man she lived with, the man who held the lives of 5 children in his hands. As she urged the horse and cart back towards the ranch, a new, terrifying thought struck her. Silas had told her Alara was leaving him. A motive. The blacksmith had told her about a cover-up, an opportunity. She had been so focused on Caleb's hostility, she had missed the real threat. She wasn't living in a house of grief. She was living in a murderer's home, and he had already started to see her digging into his secrets. How long would it be before he decided she, too, needed to be silenced? The ranch house looked more menacing than ever as she approached it, a dark blot on the landscape. She had to get the children out. But as she pulled up to the house, her blood ran cold. There was another wagon in the yard, a fine, polished wagon, pulled by 2 strong horses. It was a wagon she recognized with a gut-wrenching certainty. Standing on the porch, talking to Silas, were her parents. Elspeth froze, the reins slipping through her fingers. Her parents. Here. The 2 people who had discarded her like a broken tool. A wave of ice and fire washed over her. Her mother saw her first, her face twisting into a mask of distaste. Her father turned, his eyes cold and calculating. They didn't look at her like a daughter. They looked at her like a lost investment they had just rediscovered. Silas's face was a thundercloud. He clearly had no idea who these people were. "Elspeth," her father said, his voice slick with false warmth. "We were so worried. We heard you'd found a place here." "You sold me," she said, her voice shaking with a rage she hadn't known she possessed. "You have no right to be here." Now," her mother cooed, stepping forward. "We did what we thought was best, and it seems to have worked out for you. A big ranch. A man who provides." She looked past Elspeth to the house, her eyes gleaming with greed. Silas stepped between them, his large frame a protective wall. "Who are you?" he demanded. "We're her family," her father said smoothly. "And we've come to discuss the terms of her employment." The truth slammed into Elspeth. They weren't here out of concern. They had heard she'd landed on her feet, and they'd come for a bigger payout. They wanted to extort Silas. "Get off my land," Silas growled, his hand inching towards the pistol at his hip. "I don't think so," her father said, a sneer twisting his lips. "We know about your wife, Mr. Cole. The whole territory knows. It would be a shame if new information about that accident were to find its way to a federal marshal. A man who isn't such a good friend of yours." It was blackmail. They were threatening to use the town's suspicions against him. But then, her father did something that changed the entire game. He looked at Elspeth, a cruel, triumphant glint in his eye. "And besides," he said, his voice loud enough for Silas to hear clearly. You should know what you're dealing with. The real reason we had to get rid of her. It wasn't just because she was barren. Elspeth's world tilted on its axis. She's sick in the head, her father announced. Always has been. Sees things that aren't there. Tells lies. We tried to help her, but she's unstable. Dangerous, even. It was a lie. A monstrous, calculated lie designed to destroy her completely. To strip her of any credibility she might have. To make Silas see her not as a victim, but as a madwoman. She looked at Silas, her heart pleading with him to see the truth. But his face was unreadable. The blacksmith's words echoed in her mind. A cover-up. A sheriff who was his friend. If her parents started talking, they could ruin him. And what better way to discredit a witness than to claim she was insane? He was trapped. And so was she. Her father smiled, sensing his victory. So I think a small fee, for our silence and for taking this burden off our hands, is more than fair. The silence stretched, thick and agonizing. Elspeth watched Silas, her breath held. She saw the calculation in his eyes. Her parents' lies offered him an escape route. He could brand her a liar, throw her out, and his secrets would be safe. It was the logical choice, the safe choice. He turned to look at her, and his gray eyes were like chips of ice. She braced herself for the betrayal. She had been sold once. Being thrown away again would be nothing new. But then he looked back at her father, and his voice was low, deadly calm. You have 5 seconds to get in that wagon and ride off my property, he said. And if you ever come back, you won't be riding out. He drew his pistol from its holster. The click of the hammer being pulled back was the loudest sound Elspeth had ever heard. Her parents' faces paled. The greed in their eyes was replaced by fear. Without another word, they scrambled into their wagon and whipped the horses into a frantic gallop, disappearing in a cloud of dust. Elspeth stood there, shaking, unable to process what had just happened. He had defended her. He had chosen her over his own safety. She looked at him, 1,000 questions in her eyes. Why? She whispered. Silas holstered his pistol, his gaze still fixed on the horizon where her parents had vanished. He didn't look at her when he answered, and his voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't name. Because nobody, he said, deserves to be treated like that. He turned and walked back into the house, leaving her standing alone in the yard. But something had shifted. The wall between them had cracked. For the first time, she hadn't been a housekeeper or a suspect. She had been someone worth defending. The act of kindness, however, didn't erase the terrifying truth she had learned in town. He may have a heart, but he was still, in all likelihood, a murderer. And his defense of her might have just been the act of a man protecting his own secrets. That evening, a fragile peace settled over the dinner table. Even Caleb was subdued, glancing between his father and Elspeth with a new, uncertain expression. Later, after the children were in bed, Elspeth found Silas on the porch, staring out at the dark prairie. She had to know. She had to take the risk. The blacksmith told me the wagon axle was sawn through, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Silas didn't flinch. He just continued to stare into the darkness. He's right, he said. The admission hit her like a physical blow. So you? No, he said, finally turning to look at her. His face was a mask of agony in the pale moonlight. I didn't kill my wife, but I know who did. Elspeth's mind raced. Who? Why? It was a man from her past, Silas explained, his voice strained. Someone she knew before me. He came back. He wouldn't leave her alone. He was obsessed. Alara was leaving not because she was unhappy with me, but because she was running from him. She was trying to protect us, to protect the children. Who was he? She breathed. His name was Marcus Thorne, Silas said. the name tasting like poison. A gambler. A cheat. He followed her here. I warned him off, but he wouldn't listen. The night of the storm. He was waiting for her at the creek. He thought she was leaving me for him. When she told him she was leaving to get away from him for good, he flew into a rage. The pieces started to click into place. "But why didn't you tell the sheriff?" Elspeth asked. "Why the cover-up?" Silas let out a long, shuddering breath. "Because when I found the wagon, Thorne was already dead. I got there just after it happened." Elspeth stared at him, confused. "What are you saying?" "Thorne was lying on the ground, not 20 feet from the wagon. A rock, covered in blood, was beside his head." "So who?" And then Silas looked at her, his eyes filled with a father's terrible, heartbreaking secret. "Someone else was there," he whispered. "Someone saw what Thorne did to Alara, and they stopped him." A cold dread washed over Elspeth as she finally understood. The child's hostility, the fear, the lashing out. It wasn't hatred for her. It was a desperate attempt to protect a secret. "It was Caleb, wasn't it?" she said, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. Silas nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "He followed his mother that night. He was worried about her. He saw the whole thing. He saw Thorne attack her, saw the wagon go over. And in that moment, he picked up a rock. He's just a boy." The cover-up wasn't to protect Silas. It was to protect his son. The confession laid the house's ghosts to rest. Everything suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. Caleb's rage wasn't aimed at Elspeth, the intruder. It was a shield. A wall of anger built to hide the unbearable secret he carried, a secret that was slowly poisoning him from the inside out. He wasn't trying to drive her away because he hated her. He was trying to drive her away before she could uncover the one thing that would destroy his family forever. Silas had buried the truth to protect his son, accepting the town's suspicion and living like a ghost in his own home. He had let his wife's memory be tainted, let himself be seen as a cold, possibly violent man, all to keep Caleb out of a jail cell. "He's been living with that hell ever since," Silas said, his voice raw. "The anger. It's all he has to keep the fear at bay." Elspeth now looked at the last few weeks through a new lens. The accident at the well wasn't an attempt to harm her. It was a panicked, clumsy effort by a terrified child to scare away someone who was getting too close to the truth. The hostility, the silences, the watchful eyes. It was the desperate performance of a boy trying to be the monster everyone suspected his father of being, drawing the attention away from himself. She knew what she had to do. This family wasn't going to be healed by her cooking or her cleaning. It could only be healed by bringing the truth into the light, no matter how much it hurt. The next morning, she went to find Caleb. He wasn't in the house. She found him by the creek, the very spot where his life had fractured. He was skipping stones across the water, his small shoulders tense. She didn't approach him with pity. She approached him as an equal. "Your father told me," she said softly, standing a few feet away. Caleb froze, his arm mid-throw. He didn't turn around. "Told you what?" he mumbled, his voice tight. "He told me you were brave," Elspeth said. That made him turn. His face was a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "What are you talking about?" "You protected your mother. You protected your family. That's the bravest thing anyone can do." Tears welled in the boy's eyes, tears he had clearly been holding back for a very long time. "I didn't mean to," he choked out, the confession tumbling out of him. "He was hurting her. He pushed her, and the wagon. It fell. And she wasn't moving. He was laughing. So I picked up the rock." The shield of anger crumbled, and all that was left was a small, terrified boy. He collapsed onto the ground, sobbing, the weight of his secret finally crushing him. Elspeth knelt beside him, and for the first time, she put her arms around him. He didn't pull away. He leaned into her, his small body shaking with grief and relief. "It's not your fault," she whispered into his hair. "You were protecting her. You are not a monster, Caleb. You are a hero." They stayed there by the creek for a long time. When they walked back to the house, something had fundamentally changed. The storm in Caleb's eyes had broken. Silas was waiting on the porch. He saw his son's tear-streaked but calm face, and he looked at Elspeth with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. But their journey wasn't over. A secret that big couldn't stay buried forever. The blackmail from her parents proved that. The truth had to come out, but it had to be done in a way that wouldn't send a child to prison. Elspeth had an idea. It was a long shot, a dangerous gamble that relied on the very people who had scorned her. That Sunday, the whole family rode into town for church. It was the first time they had all gone together since Alara's death. The whispers started the moment they stepped out of the wagon. The townspeople stared, their faces a mixture of pity for the children and suspicion for Silas and the strange woman he'd brought home. During the service, Elspeth felt Caleb's hand find hers and squeeze it tight. After the sermon, as people gathered outside, Elspeth saw her chance. The sheriff was standing near the church steps, talking to Jedediah the blacksmith. With a deep breath, she walked over, Silas and the children right behind her. "Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and steady, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. "I have something to say about the death of Alara Cole." A hush fell over the crowd. The sheriff looked annoyed. "That case is closed, ma'am." "It was closed incorrectly," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the people who had whispered about her, judged her, called her Barren. "You all think you know what happened. You whisper that Silas is a cold man, maybe even a killer. You whisper that I'm just some broken woman he bought. You've been whispering the wrong stories." She then proceeded to tell them the truth. Not the part about Caleb, but the part about Marcus Thorne. She told them about his obsession, his harassment, and the sawn-through axle Jedediah had found. "Alara's death wasn't an accident," she declared. "And it wasn't at the hands of her husband. She was murdered by a man named Marcus Thorne. Silas covered it up not to protect himself, but to protect his family from the scandal and pain of a trial that would bring his wife's killer to justice, but would also drag her name through the mud. She was twisting the motive for the cover-up, shifting it from protecting Caleb's actions to protecting Alara's honor. It was a lie to protect a greater truth." The sheriff scoffed. "And you know all this how? You weren't even here." "Because Thorne left a trail," Elspeth lied, her mind racing. "He bragged about what he was going to do. We found letters he wrote to Alara threatening her. She was gambling that the sheriff's lazy investigation hadn't turned up anything, and that the word of a determined woman, backed by a respected blacksmith, was enough to plant the seed of doubt." Jedediah, seeing his chance to be part of a real story, stepped forward. "She's right, Sheriff. I saw that axle. It was no accident, and I saw that Thorne fellow lurking around town for weeks before it happened. He had bad eyes." The crowd started murmuring. The story made sense. It was dramatic, it was tragic, and most importantly, it painted Silas not as a villain, but as a grieving husband trying to protect his wife's memory. The sheriff, seeing the tide of public opinion turning, began to backtrack. "Well, perhaps we could. Reopen the investigation." "There's no need," Silas said, stepping forward, his voice full of authority. "Thorne is dead. Justice, in one form or another, has been served. All I ask is that you let my wife rest in peace, and let my family heal." He put his arm around Caleb, pulling him close, looking at the Cole family standing together, the strong father, the brave son, the loyal younger children, and the fierce woman who stood by them, the town saw something new. They didn't see a broken, suspicious group of outcasts. They saw a family. As they walked back to their wagon, the whispers that followed them were different. They were filled not with suspicion, but with respect. Elspeth had not just cleared Silas's name. She had rewritten their story in the eyes of the world. She had taken the truth and shaped it into a shield that would protect them all. Riding home, a comfortable silence filled the wagon. Caleb sat next to Elspeth, his shoulder occasionally brushing against hers. Lily was asleep in her lap. For the first time, the house on the prairie didn't feel like a destination of dread. It felt like home. That night, after putting the children to bed, Elspeth stood on the porch, looking at the same stars that had seemed so cold and distant on her first night there. Silas came and stood beside her. "What you did today," he started, his voice thick with emotion. "No one has ever fought for me like that, for my children. A family fights for each other," she said simply. He reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm, solid, real. "Elspeth, I know our arrangement was a transaction, but it's become something more, for me, for the children." He looked at her, and the storm in his eyes was finally gone, replaced by a clear, steady light. "I was wrong. This house wasn't empty because my wife was gone. It was empty because it didn't have you in it." The woman who was sold for being barren, who was told she was useless, had built a family from the ashes of two broken ones. She had found her purpose not in bearing children, but in raising them, in healing them, in fighting for them. She had learned that a mother's love isn't about blood, it's about choice. And every single day she chose them. And they, in turn, had chosen her. The prairie wind no longer sounded like a lament. It sounded like a lullaby. She was no longer the girl who was sold. She was the woman who had found her home. And in the heart of Texas, under a vast and promising sky, their real story was just beginning. If you believe that family is something you build, not just something you're born into, and that everyone deserves a second chance, don't forget to like and subscribe. There are always more stories waiting in the shadows.